Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Conrad Smith with AIM Transportation Solutions. We've got a great webinar for you focused on IFTA and IRP compliance. And as many of you know, maintaining compliance requires constant coordination, especially when it comes to accurate fuel and mileage records. And when something slips, it can quickly lead to audits, penalties, or even costly downtime. So today we're going to take a step back and walk through some of the fundamentals. And the goal here is really just to simplify things, to give you a clear picture of what's required, where companies tend to run into challenges, and how to stay on top of it all. And now just real quick before we dive in, for those of you who may not be familiar with us, AIM Transportation Solutions is a family-owned and operated business, and is also the largest privately held commercial truck leasing company in the U.S. We support companies nationwide with services like full-service truck leasing, which, as it pertains to what we're discussing today, takes much of the complexities of licensing and permitting off our customers' plates. And then we also offer commercial truck rentals, truck maintenance programs, dedicated contract carriage, and freight brokerage and used truck sales. Now, because we manage thousands of vehicles across the country, licensing and permitting is something we're really hands-on with every day. And today we're looking forward to sharing some of that perspective with you. And to walk us through today's discussion, we're joined by two AIM leaders who work closely with licensing, permitting, and fleet operations on a daily basis. Now, first we have Dan Fleming, AIM's Senior Vice President of Sales Operations. Dan has more than 30 years of industry experience and works closely with fleets across a wide range of industries, and has a strong understanding of operational challenges that companies face, and including the administrative burden that comes with compliance. Now, Dan brings an especially unique perspective, having worked in government affairs for the Truck Renting and Leasing Association, where he spent many years advocating for the industry in Washington. And he's actually still involved with the Truck Renting and Leasing Association as a current board member. And then we're also joined by Taylor Rizzi, AIM's manager of licensing, who has been with AIM nearly 10 years. And Taylor helps to oversee licensing, permitting, and compliance across the entire AIM organization, which includes our customers' leased vehicles. And Taylor also works closely with the IFTA organization itself, and is a regular participant in IFTA's annual conference. And probably most importantly, Taylor works directly with the processes we'll be discussing today. And just a quick note before I turn it over to them, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat at any time, but we will wait until the end of the presentation to address any questions, just so we can keep everything rolling and be respectful of everyone's time. So with that, Taylor, Dan, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Conrad. So like Conrad mentioned, there's a lot involved when it comes to licensing and permitting, but hands down, our primary focus is on IFTA and IRP. IFTA, so we'll just kind of try to simplify it, is the International Fuel Tax Agreement. It simplifies fuel tax reporting across 48 states and 10 Canadian provinces. It applies to commercial vehicles with an apportioned plate that are over 26,000 pounds or more than 3 axles. IFTA basically requires the quarterly reporting of 2 important sections: miles traveled by jurisdiction or state, and fuel purchased. So while it is a federal requirement and it's a staple in the industry, it's still considered very complex and it's often misunderstood. The idea is obviously that you only need to report to one jurisdiction, and then those fees are distributed amongst the participating members based on those jurisdictions' tax rates. Units that are 26,000 pounds and under do not qualify for IFTA, so you know that. And really, like I said, IFTA focuses on 2 main components. You have your records. The key records required are going to be your trip details or your mileage records and your fuel purchase details. The records are the most important component, and no matter what type, because we'll go through and discuss all the different kinds of reports and types, they all basically require the same information.
And I'll just add, Taylor, prior to 2017, we were all familiar with the paper record keeping requirements, which really you see one of the old school examples here on the screen. But as of December 18th, 2027, ELD or GPS distance records for both IFTA and IRP are now required to track a vehicle's location. That data must be in an electronic format for audit, and it has to record the odometer, the date and time, and latitude and longitude. Those records have to be kept for 4 to 6 years. And this was a significant change, but certainly streamlined record keeping and has made a driver's life easier day to day as opposed to the old paper logs. However, there's still a couple exemptions. First of all, a driver can still use the old school paper logs for no more than 8 days in a 30-day period. The intention is to cover a rental vehicle, or in our case, a substitute vehicle, although AIM does offer built-in Geotab ELD devices in all of our rental trucks for our customers' convenience. There's also an ELD exemption for short-haul drivers within a 150 air mile radius who return home within 14 hours. So in other words, other than those limited requirements, the electronic logging device provides those distance records that Taylor was talking about. And Taylor's going to go into some more details, not only on the distance, but also the other component, which is the fuel receipts.
Yes, thanks, Dan. I mean, like Dan mentioned, the paper trip, like as you see here, are still accepted, but the ELD systems, have become widespread. But here, every report still requires this basic information that you see on your screen here. Also, what you notice here is on this kind of vehicle record, you enter the location where you purchase your fuel gallons. I like to always focus on that because, when it comes to IFTA and the fuel part of this requirement, it's very important. Again, obviously, so is the mileage, but the location where you purchase your fuel is very important because your returns are going to be calculated based on that state's fuel tax rate. Now, I'm going to throw a little bit of a complicated formula at you, but I promise I'm going to make it relatable to you and simplify it for you. IFTA is basically this: your total miles divided by your MPG, that equals your taxable gallons, then minus your tax paid gallons times the state's rate. And that total is what's going to be due per state. Now, after saying all that, I want you to focus on, if you think of this in terms of fuel records, which we're going to obviously get into more of those types, those fuel records or fuel documentation is the same thing as your tax paid gallons. So if you have 0, then you're going to owe a certain amount. However, if you do the math and you subtract those tax paid gallons or your fuel documents, it will result in a lower tax. That's why we stress the importance of the fuel records. Again, as Dan mentioned before, and as I'll continue to mention, the ELD is the most popular use of, there's different types of systems out there, but every ELD system that you choose, no matter which one, produces 2 types of required reports: a summary report and a route detail report. Now, both reports are required in this audit. The summary detail report will collect the total miles by state. And then, as you can see here, all the information, it's showing what needs to be on your ELD. But the route detail report will show the date, the time, the location of each GPS reading, and the specific routes of travel. All of this data must be accessible in a digital format. And again, there's many types of ELDs out there. You just have to figure out what works best for your fleet's operations. Again, we're talking about the summary report on the last slide. This one shows the route detail report. It basically addresses time, it has addresses and shows time-stamped locations and ping points here. Now we get to the fuel documentation. And again, like I said, this is super important. All types of fuel documentation, no matter which form it comes in, has to have certain components. They must contain the date of purchase, the seller's name and address, number of gallons, fuel type, price per gallon, unit number, and purchaser name. So now we're talking about getting into the various types. Depending on the fuel vendor, there are various types, but each one has all this information. The better and the more accurate the information, the less likely it is that you're going to incur any additional expenses. Again, when we're talking about, like I mentioned before, and focusing on tax paid gallons, that's the more fuel that you show for proof of purchase, which is again what that is as well, the less amount of tax is due. Now we kind of get into the types a little bit more. You can still use a paper receipt. You can scan receipts and send via email. We do get that a lot. They do not need to be mailed. But lately, I know I've seen some current trends include adding QR codes where people are uploading information and it's going directly to where it needs to go. Another popular type of fuel report are obviously the automated vendor generated invoices. Now, those are produced by vendors such as Comdata, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with. Those kind of reports are accepted at truck stops nationwide. And these reports track fuel purchase efficiently. They contain all the information that IFTA requires. So these are basically digital records that are audit ready for compliance with IFTA. I do like to get into kind of what's been focused on a lot recently, the idea of bulk fuel. A lot of companies, you can see here one type of fuel documentation shows the copy of invoice for bulk fuel purchases. A lot of companies have large fuel tanks that they use to pump fuel into their vehicles. You want to make sure that you keep your invoice when you're purchasing bulk fuel. And then what I'm showing here on this slide is an on-site fuel report that basically documents the bulk fuel stored and used at your operations location. It's essentially the same as a withdrawal log. Some of you may be familiar with a manual form of that. And it's basically just another digitized version to keep track of fuel from a bulk storage tank. Again, focusing on this, it was something I learned in the last conference I was at that focused a lot on auditing. Bulk fuel can be tricky because it is harder to track. Again, I talked about making sure you keep your original invoice because that document is required as what they're sort of calling a two-part bulk fuel requirement. The second part of that is the withdrawal log. The information on this example here must be kept on record, whether it's in that fuel report like you see from an actual vendor, or if you're documenting your fuel another way. It's just really important to basically reconcile all of the fuel that you're putting into each vehicle, because these reports are crucial for IFTA tax compliance. They document the exact amount of fuel placed in each vehicle. Another thing I also learned is one of the first things an auditor will want to know is how you get your fuel, what type you use, and the locations of your bulk tanks. Again, here's an example of a manual log. What a lot of auditors noticed when it came to bulk fuel is that the companies, for a while, there were a lot of companies that didn't realize they needed to keep the log this way. They'd say, hey, I just fueled over at my buddy's place or whatever. But the point is, and again, it's going back to that proof of fuel purchased. If you don't know how much fuel you're used for your vehicle, then you won't be able to use it for any tax paid credit when you're filing for IFTA. Again, this goes a little bit more into the bulk fuel withdrawal records, making sure that you're putting a storage location, a date, a quantity, the fuel type. Again, all that same idea that other fuel documentation requires is the same items here, but just in a different format. These fuel records must be accurate, because basically, if they're not, what the auditor can do is they'll basically adjust your MPG. That's going to result in a higher tax liability. I mean, the worst case scenario, they could revoke your IFTA license, which you definitely don't want to happen. As Dan mentioned too, you are required to keep IFTA records for 4 years. I kind of added this last statement here just because in terms of auditing, it kind of just outlines some of the best practices that auditors are focusing right now. I added this New York HUT because New York conducts a lot of audits, not only the mileage detail, but they audit the permits themselves. And I just like to kind of say when it comes to this, though, people are scared or get worried about audits, but a good thing when it does come to audits is that it'll give you the best perspective when it comes to your fleet's compliance. So if you have any issues or if there are any issues, the audit will give you an opportunity to improve or change what might needs changed to be compliant. You might need to adjust your processes as well. I know I've had to do that here at AIM. Like I said, I've been through a few New York audits. They're managing to do it every couple of years, but all that really does is stress the importance of keeping all of the documentation, mileage and fuel, compliant for all of our qualified vehicles. We want to make sure that all of our leased and rented trucks are following the guidelines and that they're permitted correctly. And everyone, a lot of people out there are obviously familiar, I'm sure, with your IFTA decals. Those need to be, we make sure that those are placed on all qualified vehicles. You have to be careful about your inventory of those too, because, that's something that also could potentially be audited. Okay, Dan.
Thanks, Taylor. Appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
And as Taylor's been discussing, IFTA and IRP go hand in hand. IFTA being the fuel tax side and IRP being the registration side. Just to address at this point, we have some customers that might, for various reasons, handle their own fuel tax. And then the question always comes up, why do I need to provide mileage to AIM if I'm handling my fuel taxes? IRP is exactly why AIM still collects that data, because we handle this filing for our customers as well as part of our full service lease. So prior to IRP and pre-deregulation, operating authority was required in each state a carrier operated, which meant cumbersome tax filings with each of them. This resulted in the bingo stamp requirement, which existed when I first started washing trucks. You can see an example of an old school plate there, where you had to display not only on the plate, but also in literally a card in the cab, your authority to operate in that state. You had to display it and then obviously file appropriate tax filings, registration fees, other fees with each individual state. The International Registration Plan, or IRP, started in '73 with 9 founding states, but changed significantly with the Congressional Transportation Bill of 1991. That mandated the adoption of IRP by all states, which transformed this process to really a extremely cumbersome, limited ability to file with each state. And as Taylor outlined in the IFTA requirements, really streamlines it so that you only have to file with one jurisdiction. So Taylor's now going to provide us with more details about how IRP works and how it differs slightly from IFTA.
Yes, and again, Dan, thanks. That's my favorite part to talk about as far as IRP and IFTA going hand in hand. They do, you can't have the fuel without the mileage, but I will say you can have the mileage without the fuel, and that's kind of why the IRP requirement focuses on that. We talk about the fuel piece for IFTA, but which requires both, but this is where when it comes to registrations and apportion plates. So basically, as it says here, apportion plates are required for vehicles over 26,000 pounds operating interstate. Any vehicle that you have with an apportioned plate must follow the IRP guidelines. And every mile, all miles must be tracked for apportioned vehicles, whether they're loaded, empty, bobtailed, deadhead, all of them have to be tracked. And if you do happen to have an apportion plate on a vehicle that may not have the same qualification as IFTA, meaning it's not over 26,000 pounds, but you happen to have an apportion plate, you still have to turn in mileage. That sometimes is a line that it gets a little bit confusing. That's why having the actual mileage records is super important when it comes to audit, because like it says here, in the same sense that you're doing with IFTA, the registration fees are based on the miles driven in each state. So if we aren't able to track the miles in each state, then we're unable to provide whatever, jurisdiction that we would report to, we're then unable to provide them with the data they need to distribute those fees to member jurisdictions. So again, it's super important to keep the, to convey the importance of keeping your mileage records. The IRP requirement, I believe, is 6 years to keep them too, in case of audit. So again, these fees are going to ensure accuracy. They're making sure they're getting distributed, and so it's super important when people are, I don't know if you're chasing people for mileage, this is why, because we have to have these accurate miles to report so that the state that you're reporting to knows who to, how to distribute the fees. Just getting a little bit more detailed with mileage records. They used to call these, IVMRs, or individual vehicle mileage records. These are, they track miles by jurisdiction, and they were typically handwritten logs. But again, we are talking about most fleets have transitioned to ELDs which capture the data digitally, and they're obviously much easier to manage in audits. So I've said this before, I think too, every ELD system, no matter the brand or the type that may work for you, will produce the required information for an audit. So it's just important that you pick the best option for you based on your carrier operations. You wouldn't want your fleets to be penalized with registration fees, because then, it could have an adverse effect on getting vehicles on the road and being compliant. So, following these guidelines, you can avoid these issues and any potential problems. I know, excuse me, I'm sorry, I skipped a slide. I know, like I've heard when I read up, I was kind of surprised. You think about things in terms of registration fees, and I've read that during an audit, you could be penalized anywhere from 25 to 50 to even 100% of your registration fees during an audit. So for those of you out there, or I know like us, who pay a pretty significant amount of registration fees, we definitely don't want to be penalized that kind of percentage, because that would not be a good thing. But again, we talked about IFTA, and we are now kind of focusing on the mileage with IRP. Don't forget that there are select states with just a specific mileage requirement. It's based on weight and miles traveled only, and not fuel. Again, I touched on New York. They're known for consistent audits, from small operations to large, like us. They do heavily focus on permits. So it's really important that your vehicle has that $1.50 permit, or it could turn into $1,000 fine. That's what they are. And, they are very, they scrutinize and they stress time period too. You want to make sure that that, where your truck is traveling, and make sure that you have everything you need before making that trip, because if there's any time discrepancy, you could get dinged on that as well. We actually just went through a pretty heavily scrutinized New York audit. And in this instance, the correct mileage records were definitely key. We also do handle New York filing for other customers. And then just recently, I was contacted by another auditor who they're going to be auditing them. And since, we're the ones that are responsible for gathering, their mileage and fuel. And now, again, fuel doesn't matter in terms of this New York tax, but, we do all their fuel tax reporting. But for the mileage weight distance tax, we are going to be required to give New York their mileage records. So we're going to want to make sure that, everything is following guidelines, and that we work with the auditor and basically give them what they need to make sure that they're accurate as well. So again, just kind of touching and kind of summing up, some of what I said, like we maintain all of the necessary fuel and mileage records for your leased vehicles. We make sure all the information is properly filed. We reach out for information when it's missing. We let you know exactly what we need. We make sure all permits and fuel and mileage taxes are filed timely and correctly. And we make sure that your vehicles are registered properly and with the correct permits based on your operations travel habits. And I don't know if, Dan, if you wanted to touch on some of these other points here on the slide.
Well, thank you, Taylor. Yeah, this just discusses some of the other services that we provide as a full service lease truck truck leasing option for our customers, including obviously the maintenance, the road rescue, the assistance with operations, speccing and owning trucks. AIM's full service lease opportunity checks the boxes for our customers to make sure that we are taking these administrative burdens off your plate and allowing you to focus on your business, the most efficient way to operate and transport your goods to market. So, Conrad, with that, I think Taylor and I are ready to move on to questions. If you want to moderate that for us, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have a question, you can go ahead and ask it in the chat at any time. But we did have some questions submitted ahead of time. So thank you to everyone who took the time to do that. So let's go ahead and start with this question is from Mike Musser. I think I actually saw Mike on the call, so thank you for your question. What data is needed or required if you're utilizing ELD miles and ComData fuel reporting?
Yes, basically it's just that, it's what we kind of touched on with the ELD reports. They need to have your unit, they need to have the miles per state, the odometer readings, they need to have the route detail and and everything like that. So the good thing again about those is they're, like I said before, they're audit ready. They have the ability to run every report that's needed to be compliant for IFTA.
And if you have to run some paper logs, say, you have a rental truck for a little bit extra, all the items that Taylor outlined here are also required for the paper log.
All right. So the next question is from Albert Purcell, and he asks, can you order license plates online without going to the IRP office, and what is the process?
So the first thing I'll say about that, it is going to depend on the state. So like we talked about with IRP and IFTA and having that member jurisdiction, what state is your home jurisdiction? Ours is Ohio. They have a great user-friendly online portal that we can basically do everything as far as ordering plates and all that in. It's pretty good. But again, now you're going to talk about, I know Pennsylvania is not that way. They have mail-in forms still where you have to send in your reports and fill out actually paper forms in order to kind of communicate with the office. So that would be my first thing to say, like, check your jurisdiction. But yes, you can, in a lot of instances, avoid going to an actual IRP office.
All right. Next up, Jeffrey Brown asks, are fleets that are less than 26,000 GVW exclusively exempt from IFTA reporting?
Yes, anything under 26,000 is not qualified for IFTA. However, that has to be 26,001 and higher. But again, like we talked about before, if you happen to have an IRP plate or an apportion plate on your vehicle, even if it's under 26, then there's still the mileage requirement. You're taking out the fuel requirement. I always kind of like think of IFTA. You're taking that out, but that IRP requirement, if you have that apportion plate, still is you still have to comply with that requirement.
All right. Next up, Brandy Hale. I think I also saw Brandy on the call, so thank you for your question. She actually has two questions, so we'll start with the first one. Is it required to have two separate mileage summaries for IFTA and IRP?
No, the mileage reports they work for both. They work for both IRP and IFTA.
Okay. And then the next one she had, when tracking fuel purchases on the summary, do you add DEF in with the diesel purchases?
No, you do not.
Okay. All right. Next, Chris Hauer asks, can you outline the requirements for a company to maintain lease operators' service records?
And Chris, I'll field that one. We were not exactly sure about your exact question. So what I'd like to do is follow up with you offline after this. But in terms of our relationship with our customer, that's what AIM's here to do. We obviously will handle all of the service and maintenance records and fuel records that we're able to, and then work in partnership carefully with our customers to help guide you and allow for you to maintain the appropriate records. I'll just also put in a plug that John Rugarber, who works in our AIM safety department, and Conrad do fantastic webinars outlining many of these requirements that are more the carrier's requirement rather than the leasing company's requirement. So just a plug to tune in for future episodes with featuring Conrad and John.
Appreciate that. Yeah, we'll actually be doing one here soon on the international road check. So next up we have Arlen Feldstead, who asks, is there any need or advantage to have 26,000 GVW and under vehicles on apportioned plates?
Well, I'll answer that by saying there's no need. Your vehicle, if it's a non-CDL, is not required to have an apportioned plate. However, if you speaking in terms of advantage, it could be in terms of, we actually put apportioned plates on all of our rentals. We felt that it was easier, that streamlined the process of moving rentals around. Again, domicile locations change, which may change how you want to, plate your vehicle depending on moving around in different states. So we felt that, apportioned plates in our rental fleet was an advantage for us. And again, I think Dan mentioned earlier too, we have that GPS in our ELD system in all of our rentals. So that alone basically satisfies the mileage requirement. So it doesn't put the pressure on the customer. If we are renting that vehicle, they don't obviously need to worry about turning in fuel. The GPS should take care of the mileage requirement. Those reports get sent directly to us, and we can just kind of keep our fleet, maintained with those apportioned plates. So I think it can be an advantage in some cases.
And so if you work with AIM in the full service leasing product line, your lease representative can help you walk you through that process and initially set up a call with Taylor and members of her team so you can ask specific questions if you have those.
All right, so next up we have Victoria Baker, who asks, what states require separate filing from our IFTA filing? In the Southwest, we deal with New Mexico as the oddball. What others do I need to know about?
Okay, yes. So I briefly touched on those earlier. New Mexico, as you said, is one of them. New York is obviously another. We talked about that. Kentucky is a weight mileage based requirement, and Connecticut and Oregon also. Connecticut and Oregon are a little bit more motor carrier based, just based on the requirements that they have. It behooves the motor carrier to file for those, but the other ones are what we take care of as full service lease with a full service lease.
All right, and then the last of the questions that were submitted ahead of time, we have Aaron Riley, who asks, lease versus own and what needs to be done.
Again, I would say that's would be very specific, and I would think we'd best have a communication offline, but in general, it is the requirement of the operator to provide the records, like Taylor's touched on numerous times. Since AIM is not operating the vehicle except in cases of dedicated contract carriage or integrated, we look to our customers to provide those records. But then the advantage of a full service lease is you have Taylor and her team in place to take those records, handle the administrative burden, handle the filing, handle the questions that come up. And so I think that's the advantage. We can provide guidance on what data to collect like we have today, and can also provide assistance with ELD providers. I know AIM has a great relationship with the folks at Geotab, but as Taylor said numerous times, there's many ELD products out there that work best for certain carriers. So you would obviously choose one that fits best for you. So I don't know if that completely answers your question, but we'd love to engage with a follow-up if you have more specifics.
All right, awesome. So, and we did get a question submitted from Stephanie. She asked for IFTA and New York HUT, where do you add the bulk fuel gallons?
So it doesn't require, the New York HUT is simply mileage tax. So you don't have to worry about reporting fuel when you're reporting for New York HUD. It's simply reporting mileage in the state of New York. So again, the bulk fuel, again, it depends on how you're processing your tax return. It's more important to keep the records and knowing, and again, it depends on what system you might be using to enter your information. You just need to make sure that the records that you keep reflect the requirements and that you know how much fuel is going to go into each vehicle. And then again, how it depends on, like I said, in our case, we handle other customers, we handle the fuel tax reporting and we have a fleet management system. All of that information gets entered, for that specific vehicle, and it gets processed and the taxes get filed in that way. But like I said, we need to get from the customer those, those fuel records and those mileage records that comply with the records we have to have on hand for IFTA. We have to have that stuff on hand in order to be considered a tax paid purchase. I hope that makes sense. Again, if you need more explanation, I'm happy to talk further about it.
All right, and we just had another question come through. Abby asks if a Pennsylvania company is leasing units to Ohio operator, who is responsible for reporting? Are they both required to report?
I mean, it depends, but what we do is, we report. I mean, if you have an account and if you are leasing from another company, but you have an IFTA account and you want to file your own, we do, that can happen. We ask for the customer to provide us with a copy of, their IFTA license, so that we can have it on hand and you can file your own. We have some customers that do choose to do that. They're leasing trucks from us, but they have a Pennsylvania account. We do help some customers out and will provide some services for their owned accounts in some circumstances as well. It can be a little bit difficult sometimes just because, we do have so many trucks we maintain here and we hope to be able to provide the full service lease and those services within that realm of that. But again, you can report to one jurisdiction, but because of the reciprocity, it doesn't really matter where you're leasing from.
Correct. And I'll just add on to that. It sounds confusing sometimes, but the IFTA state does not have to be the same as the IRP state. As Taylor just mentioned, we have customers that lease from AIM. So the IRP tags are Ohio apportion tags, but then they, for various reasons, she mentioned, they choose to do their own IFTA filing. They could have a Pennsylvania IFTA sticker on the truck or a Maryland IFTA sticker on the truck and handle their own filing with that separate jurisdiction. So both entities don't ever file for the same truck for the same service. But in that example, AIM would file for the IRP service through Ohio. Our lease customer can file for their IFTA filing in, say, the state of Pennsylvania as an example. And the customer's Pennsylvania IFTA decal would appear on the side of the truck, not AIM's Ohio IFTA decal on the side of the truck. So I know there is some confusion about that sometimes, but I think the system's set up for maximum flexibility to provide this ability for us to handle the truck, for a customer to handle IFTA if requested. However, standard is AIM provides that service to all of our full service lease customers, and it's, as Taylor mentioned, only optional if it's better for our operating customers to file separately for them to do so.
Right, and I'll just add a little part of that. I mean, exactly, Dan's right, but the only thing, just keep in mind too, the IRP plate though has to file the IRP account. Those have to be the same, just in case sometimes, again, all of it gets confusing, but you can't have an IRP account in Ohio and if you had a Pennsylvania, you know what I mean? That wouldn't go together, obviously.
Correct.
All right, well, I don't see any other questions. So just want to let everyone know that I will be sending out a follow-up email later this week, and that email is going to contain a link to the recording of today's webinar, and it'll also contain some additional resources that Taylor has gathered for everyone that should be valuable for for anyone filing IFTA or IRP. And then also, if you'd like to learn more about any of AIM's services, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'd be more than happy to get you connected with one of our experts. Everyone here should have my email from the webinar calendar invites that went out, but if not, you can just reply to that follow-up email that I will be sending out. So with that, thanks again to Dan and Taylor for sharing your expertise, and thank you all for spending part of your day with us. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody.